Hello and welcome to this special broadcast on behalf of the British Bullshit Corporation. Hi there, my name's Ed, and I think the BBC's about to get in the sea. Its funding has just been frozen, and its main source of income, the licence fee, will soon be a thing of the past. Whether you like the BBC or not, it's clear that the current government holds it in particularly gross contempt. This is mostly thanks to the work of a long line of culture secretaries, who all seem to think the BBC is their biggest enemy, in spite of the fact that it usually toes the government line. The current culture secretary, Nadine Dorries, is a staunch defender of Boris Johnson, and for her, that makes an enemy of any news organisation that takes the criticism against him even vaguely seriously. Asked whether the BBC would still be around in 10 years' time, Dorries simply said, "I don't know." Dorries also believes that left-wing snowflakes are killing comedy, which I suppose includes me? But is the culture secretary the problem with the BBC, or does it go deeper? Is the BBC even equipped for the 21st century? And if it is it worth saving? Let's find out with the help of some middle-aged white men and some more middle-aged white men. Seriously, the book about an organisation overloaded with middle-aged white men was written by middle-aged white men. So welcome to this video essay on middle-aged white men and the British Broadcasting Corporation, insofar as they're distinguishable.
Oh, well, of course you must have vegetables!
Our tale begins with John Humphreys, host of Radio 4's flagship Today programme from 1987 to 2019. A respected, hard-hitting, and often outspoken journalist, Humphreys was, for the longest time, the jewel in the BBC's journalistic crown. He would cut to the heart of the issue, interview across the political spectrum, and defend the BBC's long-standing commitment to impartiality in broadcasting. Shortly after retiring from the Today programme, Humphreys came out as gender critical. This man, this supposed paragon of journalistic integrity, genuinely believes that British schools teach children that there are 100 genders.
And 100 different genders?
He reads Douglas Murray, for God's sake. Douglas Murray, the mouthpiece for endless legitimate concerns and tacit supporter of the Great Replacement. Humphreys was covering his back while he worked for the Beeb. He got out and immediately joined the cadre of so-called liberals who, when it comes down to it, divvy up rights based on what they personally find acceptable, denying possible lives to anyone who falls outside their definition of normal. But Humphreys was just the start. With 2 years of hindsight in their back pocket, BBC News published an article suggesting that trans women were coercing lesbian women into sex. Putting aside the absurdly problematic core argument of the article, its sample size was oddly small, and the organisations it chose to contact were far from unbiased. In fact, they were bordering on transphobic, and the timing of this couldn't have been worse. Only a couple of weeks later, the BBC withdrew from Stonewall's inclusivity programme. After several days of protest against the transphobic article, the BBC's Director of Editorial Standards, David Jordan, stated that impartiality should triumph over personal identity, and chose to conflate trans identity with cancel culture. Judging by Jordan's comments, the failure of the BBC to stop this sort of transphobic content getting through the net is an indication of something going wrong at the top. It's not just the writer who's at fault. An editor decided this copy was fit to print, and that editor will be following guidelines set by someone more senior. Like, I don't know, the Director of News? Well, the BBC's Director of News went on the record to tell queer people that they have to get used to views they don't like. I'm sorry if this feels like a bit of a bad news barrage, but it just feels like this toxic culture hasn't got enough heat and needs to be challenged. Of course, naturally, all this bile comes with a context of Tory meddling to undermine and threaten the organisation. During the BBC's latest charter renewal process, former Culture Secretary John Whittingdale publicly urged, against the evidence, for the BBC to be smaller and less distinctive. Once the charter renewal was complete, former Chancellor George Osborne issued a new funding settlement for the BBC that required it to take responsibility for funding free licences for over 75s, at a cost of £608 million to the organisation itself. Osborne later went on to become the editor of London's Evening Standard newspaper, which has an online presence not unlike BBC News. Then, under Boris Johnson, the Tories tried more than once to appoint ex-Daily Mail editor Paul Dacre as chair of Ofcom, the regulator that polices the BBC, in a clear attempt to weaken it. They're still trying on that one, but they did successfully appoint former financier and Tory donor Richard Sharp as chair of the BBC board. Then, a new voice joined the debate, arguing that the BBC was insular and full of nepotism. Spot on. The Tories really nepotised their way into the broadcasting space. Who said that then? Oh, it was Tory Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries. But you see, even before the likes of Sharp, Dacre and Whittingdale, the BBC was built and maintained by the establishment. These were Oxbridge folks with an old-fashioned liberal angle. You can see why good old liberalism might upset a culture war character like Dorries, but it's just as problematic for society at large. Being liberal isn't the same as being unbiased. What does the evidence tell us about BBC bias then? To answer that, we'll need to look at the research compiled by Barwise and York in their lengthy defence of the corporation entitled The War Against the BBC. These two found that the BBC receives a roughly equal number of complaints that it is either too left-wing or too right-wing. In terms of airtime, they suggest that while the BBC is broadly impartial, at times it overrepresents the establishment right-leaning view in favour of the government of the day, a trend that has deepened under Conservative government. This isn't surprising. In its current state, overwhelmed by establishment middle managers, subject to vicious partisan inquiries from Whittingdale, and even harsher funding cuts by Osborne, the BBC has a pretty strong incentive to toe the government line. Even then, it's popular to caveat that the BBC isn't a monotonous organisation.
BBC is not monolithic.
It has lots of different journalists with lots of different voices.
There are those people who work for it who take one view, there are those people who work for it who take another view.
But if there are pro-trans voices in the BBC, it feels like they're not cutting through. The BBC can be as reasoned as it likes on broader issues, but when it comes to the identity politics of the current government, it does seem to lean right. The BBC will also happily present the government shuffling money around as new funding, and it will default to Western narratives when it comes to foreign affairs and global conflict. So while the BBC is unbiased in situations where being unbiased is easy, it still requires some reading between the lines, especially on identity politics, big ticket Tory policy, and international relations. This means that you have to perform exactly the same exercise as you would with any other broadcaster to figure out what to think of their stories. Just as you might reposition the coverage of, say, The Guardian or the Daily Telegraph in the context of their politics, you have to do the same with the BBC on the basis that it tends to be gently supportive of the government view. So all this means the BBC isn't necessarily providing the impartial service one would expect of a state broadcaster. And this becomes even clearer when we look at how the BBC approaches two critical topics: climate change and capitalism. For the BBC, climate change is up for debate, when it should be taken for granted. And capitalism is taken for granted when it should be up for debate. This was placed in particular focus during the first round of Extinction Rebellion protests, where the BBC failed to platform Extinction Rebellion activists while continuing to platform so-called climate skeptics. This was a perfect opportunity to shift its coverage to reflect the balance of opinion in society, and the BBC simply didn't do it. In fact, it never has, and it never will, so long as it is run by the likes of Humphreys, Jordan and Sharp. In the words of BBC critic Tom Mills, the BBC will aim to fairly and accurately reflect the balance of opinion among elites. The BBC is run by establishment figures with historic links to the other institutions that still run our daily lives, dating back about 50 years, which explains the old school liberal approach. It also explains why the BBC has to date failed to take action on its gender pay gap, below the national average, but notable for its tendency to pay men and women vastly different amounts for exactly the same job. That's not to say the BBC's approach is excusable because of its old-fashioned leadership. Climate denial isn't excusable. Trans denial isn't excusable. Savile definitely wasn't excusable, and the way the BBC dealt with that number was especially naffed around the houses. But it's doubtful whether any of this would change under a Labour government. One need only look to the way Labour's entrenched centre-right party HQ actively punished Jeremy Corbyn's success to get an indication of how actors with established power behave when their dominion is threatened. In the words of Ken Loach, the BBC is the voice of the ruling class, urbane and benign when confident, ruthless when threatened. In terms of resolving this problem, leftist messiah Mark Fisher argued for introducing collective deliberation and decision-making into a national broadcasting model. But in spite of his support for the public sector, even Fisher acknowledged that genuinely experimental TV is something the neoliberal BBC cannot offer. It's not surprising then that Fisher preferred the back catalogue of Channel 4, which benefits from state funding to get a bit zany, but isn't at the mercy of the British government. So it's even less surprising that the Tories want to dismantle Channel 4 completely. Let Auntie Beeb eat itself, and cannibalise the cool uncle. Now, all this isn't to say we couldn't have a progressive, participative and representative public service broadcaster if we went out and demanded one. It's more to say the BBC just ain't it. Maybe we should stop asking if the BBC can be reformed and start asking whether it can even survive. Now, Barwise and York make some pretty strong arguments for the BBC's staying power. The last time the BBC's reach was measured, in 2015, it was found that 99% of households use BBC services in a single given week. The licence fee still only costs 43 pence a day, which is 8.7 pence per average adult user hour. You would have to watch about 3.8 hours of Netflix on a daily basis to get the same value for money. And while that's entirely possible for someone who's either powerfully lazy or powerfully depressed, Netflix doesn't provide a news service, a radio service, or a totally serviceable recipe website. But whether the BBC is good value is a different question from whether it's what people want. And it's that second question that begs answering. In spite of the fact that this book was published at the tail end of the first lockdown in the UK, it doesn't really reflect the post-COVID media ecosystem. Streaming services are growing more and more segmented, and the water cooler moment is completely out the window. While Netflix and co were never the killing blow to the BBC, the patterns of consumption they created place it in serious jeopardy. So the BBC needs to find a way to hold on to the viewers that it already has, which is hard when they tend to be either A, roughly the age of John Humphreys, or B, someone who gives a shit about trans rights. The gender-critical bigotry on show from the BBC will only disenfranchise those who were already reluctant to help pay for it, the overwhelmingly young contingent who actually support intersectionality and can't be fecked to buy a licence fee. Putting BBC Three on terrestrial won't bring these folks back. Their patterns of consumption are going to stay as diffuse as they've always been. The worst part is, the BBC actually had a plan to beat the streaming services at their own game way back in 2007, but that scheme got shut down for exactly the same reason that the BBC's funding keeps getting cut. The establishment are too worried that it could succeed in the right hands, and they will never let that happen. You know, I actually find that quite sad, being old enough to hold a certain sentimentality for the Beep. I grew up watching Dick and Dom in Da Bungalow. Bogies! I lay awake petrified by the baddies from Doctor Who, and I built a long-standing love-hate relationship with Top Gear. I don't for a second deny that the BBC was great once, but its time has come and gone. The current government doesn't respect it, and funnels its cronies into its highest echelons, all under the bracket of continuing impartiality in broadcasting. Meanwhile, streaming services and news websites of all colours push the BBC into the background, whether it likes it or not, whether it's good value or not. And the past 10 years have just served to further underline the BBC's irrelevance, except as a producer of occasionally sound comedy or drama programmes and a good source of radio talent. No better than a Netflix studio and a professional podcasting group spliced together like Jeff Goldblum and a particularly transaverse fly. Look, when the BBC dies, and it will die, the Tories should be brought to answer for its post-mortem. But the rest of us shouldn't be mourning. Anyway, more views for BreadTube!
No!